Professor Sanjayji said, is the biggest and the highest plateau on Earth. And this came about because of the tectonic shift between the Gondwanas, which is the Indian plate, and the Eurasian plate. Geologists even today say that Tibet is growing by 10 millimeters every year because the tectonic shifts are still happening. And I keep repeating this statement because the tectonic shift is still garnering a lot of friction or tension within the Earth's surface, that you have earthquakes from Afghanistan to Burma almost on a regular basis. This needs to be understood to understand. To understand Tibet, it's very important to understand the geography of Tibet also. Without understanding the geography of Tibet, then it's difficult to understand the people and the history of Tibet as well. So today, unfortunately, Tibet has become the largest open air prison in the world, where you don't have access to Tibet. If you have to go to Tibet, then you need a special permission from the Chinese government. Just a visa to go to China is not enough. It's like going to a third country. So there's so much restriction because China keeps saying that there's no Tibet problem. We keep saying if there is no Tibet problem, and as what China says, Tibet is a socialist paradise, then we keep saying, why don't you allow people to go see for themselves whether it's a paradise or a hell? So people still don't have access. Of course, most of the visitors are coming from China. They do give some access to Tibetans who live outside these days, but it's still very, very restrictive. Even if you have a visa for 15, 20 days, you are allowed to stay only in that region. You are not allowed to go outside of that region. And political freedom that we take it for granted here in India does not exist in Tibet. You can't even own a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. If you say long life, His Holiness Dalai Lama, you go to jail. You have a picture of His Holiness, you go to jail. If you have a Tibetan name with any nationality that you comes from, you will be stuck at the airport between 2 to 14 hours because they look through all your baggages and your mobile phones to find out whether you have any articles that could instigate the Tibetans to take up actions that may not be in their favor. So let me start by just saying, giving you an overview of what Tibet is, because we talk about global politics, we talk about geopolitics, we talk about geostrategy and all that, but sometimes we miss the finer points, the basic information about Tibet. So that's why I had this small presentation, and it does leave an imprint in your mind with the images that are there, because it's not hand drawn, these are all satellite images. And this is the first picture, shows you how high the Himalayas are. Right? We call our land the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So we have the Himalayas in the south, Karakoram in the west, the Kunlun in the north, Yenchen Kangla also in the north, and so many mountains and rivers and that surround Tibet. So we call it the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. And then Westerners started coming into Tibet by late 16th century, and then they started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Now, why again the roof of the world? Because in one of these, of course, there have been quite a number of Westerners, but you can count them on your fingers because it's not easy to come into Tibet or for Tibetans to go out of Tibet. You need a special lung to go into Tibet, and you need a very sturdy physical fitness to be able to walk across the mountains and down valleys. So one of the Christian missionaries in 1906, that's what I've seen in one of his books, he has titled one of the chapter as Roof of the World. Maybe it started from there, or maybe people already called Tibet as the Roof of the World earlier than that. The reason for these people to call Tibet the Roof of the World is because of Tibet's altitude, which is about 4,880 meters above sea level, or about 16,010 feet above sea level. That is the average altitude. So when I travel around the world, speak to universities, in Japan and other countries, I always look up the map and find out which is the highest mountain in their country. Just like in Japan, when we ask them, they say Mount Fuji. How high? 3,700, 3,800 meters. Then I tell them that is like the base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there. So that's just to give them an imagination of how high Tibet is. And according to NASA, it's the highest plateau on Earth. As I mentioned before, it's also the biggest plateau on Earth. It's home to Mount Everest, 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet above sea level. And as Professor uh, Sanjay mentioned, Tibet is about 2.5 million square kilometers, and China is 9.7 million kilometers. So that's Tibet is almost quarter of China, maybe about two-thirds of India, bigger than Mexico, 10 times the size of UK, 16 times the size of Japan. So all these measurements you have. So Tibet is not a small country. I keep repeating this because one time a Pakistani journalist asked me, which is bigger, Bhutan or Tibet? So if you don't have an idea of the geography in the region, then you don't have any idea of the political situation as well. So then now the environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole. You have South Pole, you have North Pole. So aside from these two poles, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers. Professor Sanjay also mentioned about some of these facts here. Can we go to the next screen? It's the largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost outside of Arctic and Antarctic, and it has about 46,000 glaciers, according to UNEP. And then according to Chinese Academy of Sciences, it has 14,500 cubic kilometer of glacial ice. And Tibet is also called the climate regulator. Some call it the rainmaker because of the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan Plateau and the impact of El Nino, the warming of the Pacific, combined together decides the monsoon in the region, including in India, which are going to be the hotspots where going to be the depressions and where the rainfall is going to come, which areas going to be hot. Now, Professor Sanjay also mentioned about the melting of the ice on the Tibetan Plateau, which is twice the speed of what's happening in everywhere else in the world. Of course, it's 3, 4 times more on the polar regions. So because of the melting of ice on the Tibetan Plateau, you have more and more severe heat waves in Europe. And those heat waves is going to increase over the years. And this is being caused partly because of the melting of ice on the Tibetan Plateau. Just before going to Brazil about 2, 3 years ago, I also found a report of a scientific journal, a study done by climatologists, a correlation between the Amazonia, which is the lung of the world, and Tibet, the roof of the world. And they found that when there is more rain in Amazonia, there is less snow in Tibet, and when there's more snow in Tibet, there's less rain in Amazonia. So this just gives you an indication as to the fact that we live in an interdependent world. Everything that happens, even climatically, everything that happens in one small part of the world can have its impact on the rest of the world. So Tibet's environment is not only important for Tibet, but for not only for the region, it's important globally. And the reason why the Tibet is also called as water tower of Asia today, because from Tibet you have all these rivers going into 10 different countries in East and South and Southeast Asia, including China. So the two major rivers of China, Yellow and Yangtze, which supplies water to north and south of China, are the lifelines of China. Both of these rivers originate from Tibet. And in fact, on the Yellow River, the Chinese civilization came about on the banks of Yellow River. Then you have the Mekong going into 5 Southeast Asian countries: Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, Mekong is the lifeline for these 5 countries. Then you also have Salween going into, or the Irrawaddy going into Burma. Then you have the Brahmaputra coming from Western Tibet to Eastern Tibet, take a U-turn, comes into Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, just coming from Guwahati. Last few days we were there, and goes into Bangladesh. Then you have the Karnali going into Nepal, joining the Ganges. Ganges also starts on the border between India and Tibet. Then you also have Jhelum and Indus that goes into India and then into Pakistan. And Indus is again home to another very old civilization, the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilization. So all these countries that I mentioned, from Pakistan to Nepal to India to Bangladesh to five Southeast Asian countries to China, are some of the most densely populated areas in this world. And some say that Third World War could happen because of water. If that is the case, then Tibet is going to be a huge bio hotspot. Some environmentalists suggest or estimate that between 1.8 to 2 billion people out of the 8 billion people in this world have something or other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. So we are talking about serious food and water security in the years to come, because China does not share water. Forget about water sharing, but they don't even share hydrological data with any of its downstream countries. So these are just to give you an overview of the strategic, because Tibet historically has played as a buffer between the what is now the two most populous nations in this world. And if there could be a peaceful, negotiated, mutually beneficial solution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, then we believe that it could contribute towards more peace and stability, not just for China or Tibetans, but for the whole region. A lot of distrust could be removed because of the solution of the Sino-Tibet conflict. So just to give you an overview about history of Tibet, because the connection between India and Tibet is not very well understood, even though we live here in India for the last 65 years and sometimes believe that by now most of the Indians should be knowing about Tibet, but unfortunately even some of the intellectuals in Dharamsala, not just in Dharamsala, also in Delhi, sometimes misses the nitty-gritties of Tibet. So Tibet, as I mentioned, came about because of the tectonic shift 50 million years ago, and which means before 50 million years ago, there must have been a beach on the Tibetan southern border. So if you look at the Himalayan mountains in the west, you will see more sands and pebbles than rocks. So you can see it emerged out of the sea. You know? And the human habitation on the Tibetan plateau is being estimated at about 30,000 years ago. If they in future find more older things, then again they will have to change the dates. But then the first king of Tibet, we have a widely accepted history of more than 2,200 years. So the first king of Tibet, Songtsen Nyati Zembo, the shoulder enthroned king. There are several versions of where this king came from, and two of the versions is that one is this prince or the king of Tibet, first king of Tibet, came from Bengal, and another one is that this first king of Tibet was a defeated Kaurava prince. So there are two versions that comes from Indian side, and of course there's another version that says this prince, king came from a part of Tibet in Kongpo. So whatever it is, there is some linkage with the first king of Tibet and India. Then between 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. We even dethroned the Tang emperor and replaced him with a puppet, not for very long. Then we even went up to the present Samarkand in Uzbekistan. That used to be the extent of Tibetan empire at one time, alongside China and later Mongolia. So during those periods, the first religious king of Tibet, Songtsen Gampo, sent his minister, Thumisambadu, to India to invent a Tibetan script. And this script, because I keep giving these small nuggets of information, because people keep asking us, do your Tibetan language have something to do with Chinese language? Because right now we are occupied by China. But Tibetan language has nothing to do with Chinese language, because Chinese is pictographic. And Tibetan language came from the Indian Devanagari script of the Gupta and the Brahmi. So our connection linguistically also with India starts from 7th century. Then Buddhism came into Tibet in 8th century, even though Buddhism went to China in 3rd, 4th century. And when the Tibetan emperor married a Chinese princess, they brought one Buddha from China, and he also, the same emperor had a Nepalese wife, Brikudi Devi. She also brought another Buddha statue to Tibet in the 7th century, but the learning and the study of Buddhism had not started by that time. And there were some Chinese monks there, along with the Chinese princess, but then Tibetans didn't adopt that. In fact, King Chisung Dezwe organized a debate between the Chinese Hoshangs, the monks, Chinese monks, and the Indian monks, follower of Shantarakshita called Kamarashila. They had this debate, and the Tibetan emperor decided that we should go for Indian Buddhism that's rooted in the Nalanda tradition. So even now, we follow the Nalanda tradition. Now, China is trying to distort that fact by saying that the Buddhism that went into Tibet and Central Asian countries went from China. That's not the truth. The truth is the Tibetan Buddhism came from India directly. And then, on the advice of Shantarakshita, he said, since you already have your language, which was by that time 100 years old, why don't you transliterate every available Sanskrit and Greek Buddhist, Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan, rather than me teaching you in Sanskrit or Pali? So that is exactly what the Tibetans did. So many Tibetan translators worked for centuries, through 5 centuries, from 8th to 13th century, before Buddhism almost vanished out of India. Our translators transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan. So today, if you want to study Buddhism in totality, whether it's Tantrayana or Vajrayana, then Tibetan is the only language that you can study Tibetan Buddhism in its entirety. In fact, we are very proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom. No other country, including China, has done that kind of transliteration. We must have produced the largest number of literature at one time. So even now, you count the Buddhist literature, it goes beyond 100,000 titles. We are in the process of digitalizing all these scriptures today. And now there are also programs to return it back in Sanskrit from Tibetan. So the structure of the language is same, because Tibetan also came from Indian script, and it's very easy to get it back in Sanskrit in its original form. Then Tibet went through 400 years of disintegration. There was not one single ruler who could rule Tibet between 9th to 13th century. But even during those times, Tibetan lamas came to India several times in one lifetime, climbing over the Himalayas, bringing all their wealth to offer to the Indian masters to learn from them, and went back to Tibet. And then we had this, apart from the Nyingma tradition, which is the oldest Buddhist tradition in Tibet, starting from 8th century, then we have the Sakyapa tradition and the Kagyupa tradition during those periods, even though politically we were disintegrated, but spiritually we were gaining a lot from India. Even by the end of 13th century, end of 12th century, beginning of 13th century, in 1206, Bhaktiar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet from northeast India, from Kuch Bihar, and only 100 returned back. I don't mean to say that all the 10,000 army of Bhaktiar Khilji were killed by the Tibetans, but what I mean to say is that even at the fag end of the disintegration of Tibet, Tibet's borders were well protected. Because Bhaktiar Khilji was responsible for destroying Nalanda and Otantapuri and other Buddhist monasteries. If Bhaktiar Khilji had been successful in coming into Tibet in the beginning of 13th century, he would have destroyed Buddhism in Tibet as well. But fortunately, we managed to send his army back. Maybe it's not just Tibetans who killed all the remaining 9,900 army of Khilji. On their retreat, Indians might have also done their part, but that is part of the history. And then Mongols became a big power in Central Asia with Genghis Khan. Tibetans initially surrendered because they were smart not to be decimated by the Mongol Empire because Mongols were merciless. They could kill anybody. And then they were looking for a spiritual master. And they found one in Tibet in the form of Sakya Pandita Kunga. So we developed this priest-patron relation, just as we call India as our master and we as the Chelas, Guru-Chela relationship between India and Tibet. So also with the Mongols, we became the masters and the Mongols became the Chelas, the students. So we developed this priest-patron relationship where Mongols protect Tibet and Tibetans give spiritual lessons to the Mongol Khan and his followers. That's why today all of Mongolia are Buddhist because it's spread from Tibet. Then you also have Buddhists in the Russian republics of Kalmykia, Tuva, and Burya. They are also an extension of the Mongolian family. Even today, people from Russia come to listen to His Holiness in Dharamsala. We have that connection. And then we developed relations with the Mongols by mid-13th century, even before the Mongols invaded China. And the Mongols did not rule Tibet directly. It was always the Tibetans who ruled Tibet. So in 1271, Kublai Khan invaded China. By 1278, the whole of China was under Kublai Khan's control. So it was Mongols who invaded China. And that period between 1271 to 1368, when the Mongols ruled China, is known as the Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N. But the Mongols were there even after the Yuan dynasty. So our relations with the Mongols went up to 1720 in the 18th century, before the Manchus started exerting their influence over Tibet, when they were more powerful between 1735 to 1795 for almost 660 years. But after the overthrow of Mongols by the Ming Chinese, who ruled China from 1368 to 1644, we had no political connection with the Mings, because Mings are the real Han Chinese. For almost 280 years, we had nothing to do with China. We had some religious representations, but no political connection with the Mings at all. Then the Qings overthrew the Ming in 1644, 2 years after the fifth Dalai Lama had taken over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet. So if you do comparative study, you can find out the difference also there. When the Qings took over, initially the fifth Dalai Lama was also very powerful, not because Tibet had a big army, because of its value to the Chinese emperor, because Mongols were marauding the Chinese on all fronts. That's why Chinese call the Mongols and Tibetans as barbarism. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the only one who could convince the Mongols not to attack the Chinese. And then the Chinese emperor, the Qing emperor, used it to his advantage. Even the fifth Dalai Lama visited China. And at that time, as equals, the Chinese emperor had to come several distance to receive the Dalai Lama. They were seated on equal throne. And that used to be the relationship. Then from 6th Dalai Lama to 7th Dalai Lama, we had some problems, political issues inside Tibet. There were the last influence of the Mongols. And then the Manchus started coming in by 1720. But even then, Manchus never directly administered Tibet. By 19th century, by 1838, then you have the Opium War during the Qing dynasty, which China still calls it 100 years of humiliation. So they were facing colonial rule from other parts. So when China was not able to control itself, then how can you imagine China to be controlling Tibet during those periods, during the Qing dynasty? Then by the end of 19th century, there was some development over the great game that people are talking about. You can read this in one of the books written by a former ambassador quite recently, just last year, Dilip Mehta, Dilip Sinha, sorry, Dilip Sinha, because there's one Dilip Mehta and Dilip Sinha. So Dilip Sinha, we just had another session in Delhi before I went to Guwahati and Lucknow, coming to Lucknow this time to celebrate His Holiness 75th anniversary of assuming the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet. So Ambassador Sinha had written a book called Imperial Games in Tibet, and former MEA Secretary Nirupama Raoji had also written a book called Fractured Himalayas. If you read these books, this will give you more details about what had happened during those periods. So, in the beginning of last century, we were attacked from three sides. One by British India, led by Young Husband in 1903-1904 into Tibet, which made the 13th Dalai Lama to flee into Mongolia and later to China till about end of 1909. And then Amdo was attacked by a warlord called Mabufang, and Kham was attacked by the Qing generals in the beginning of last century. Started from there. And by the time His Holiness reached, by the time Britishers went out of Tibet, established a trade agreement, and then His Holiness went to China and came back 3 months after that. Then Tower from another general was on the frontier of eastern Tibet in Kham, and the 13th Dalai Lama had to again go to exile into India. I don't know how many of you know about these facts. I met with Lord Curzon in Kolkata and then lived in and around Darjeeling and Kalimpong for almost 2 years. By that time, the Qing dynasty had fell, 1911. Nationalist movement had taken over. China was in trouble, and we kicked out every single Chinese army out of Lhasa and Tibet by 1912. Just recently, a document was on sale. That's what to be one of these auction houses of a document that talks about, with the seal of the 13th Dalai Lama, which talks about giving food and supplies to the Chinese army, because we didn't want to send them from the Tibetan border into China because they could come back with reinforcement. So we send them through India. The reason why you have some Chinese in Kolkata, not all the Chinese in Calcutta were those who were kicked out from Tibet, but part of them were from those kicked out from Tibet, but then returned back to China. So again, we have a relation with the nationalist movement, the Kuomintang, KMT, who ruled China. And then there was a civil war between the KMT and the communists for a long time, till the communists took over in 1949. So during all of this period, during the 13th Dalai Lama, we signed the 1914 Shimla Agreement as an independent state. So the Shimla Agreement that defines the boundary between India and Tibet, particularly in the eastern sector, in Arunachal Pradesh, was signed between British India and independent Tibet. So after India got independent in 1947, then India has the obligation to pursue with the treaty obligations that British India had signed with other countries. In that sense, India also has the obligation to carry through with the 1914 agreement that we signed with British India as an independent state. So till 1951, we were an independent state. Because according to international law, they say after the signing of the so-called 17-point agreement, then Tibet became part of China, or occupied part of China. If that is the case, then China's attack on Tibet's border in Chamdo was October 1950. 1 month after that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, at this very tender age of 15, we all can imagine what we were doing at the age of 15. His Holiness had to take over the spiritual and temporal leadership on 17th November 1950. 6 months after that, we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement. The official seal of the government was with His Holiness on the Indian border in Yatung, because His Holiness was in Yatung just in case if Chinese come into Lhasa, he will need to escape. But finally he returned back in 1951, back to Tibet. And that is how all this. We tried to live under the 17-point agreement for 8 long years. In between, His Holiness was in China between 1954 to 55, met with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Tu Dai, and all the leaders of those times, and found that everything looked very orderly, but people didn't have the freedom to speak their mind. And then 1956-57, His Holiness was in India, and he visited the Indian Parliament, just nascent democracy, 10 years ago, independence. After independence, very chaotic in the Parliament, but His Holiness found that everybody had the freedom to speak their mind. So that is why His Holiness was very impressed by democracy, and not even 1 year after coming into exile in 1959, 1960, His Holiness introduced democracy in exile. That is the reason why an ordinary person like me today can be the elected political leader or Sikkim. So if it is not for His Holiness leadership, I wouldn't be here. I don't know what would have happened to the Tibetan struggle also. And after we came into exile, of course, we had a lot of difficulties. Some 85,000 Tibetans preceded or followed His Holiness. We were not used to Indian weather, very hot weather in Buxar, Missouri, where we were put up in 2 transit camps. So, and there were no skills that we could use. We were not skilled at all. Even though Tibetan script came from India, the language is completely different. So we didn't understand any Indian languages as well. So the Tibetans were later put up in the foothills of Himalayas because the only thing they could do was hard labor. So if you go to Manali, Darjeeling, the Champa, and in Arunachal Pradesh also, you will remember that the first roads were built by Tibetans in those areas. Then Pandit Nehru wrote to all the state chief ministers asking them who would be willing to provide support for Tibetan rehabilitation, and Karnataka was the first to offer 3,000 acres of land where I was born. So I consider myself an Indian and more a Kannadiga. Because our thinking is the same. Our philosophy is shaped by Indian philosophy, so that dictates our way of life and our way of thinking. So we, even though we look a little different, more like the Northeast people, but we think similar, same. We're very much alike. So we don't find difficulties in living in India, having to adapt ourselves to live in a foreign land. We feel very comfortable. Just as Professor Sanjay said, he asked the Tibetans here whether they were happy or not. We can't be more happy. There are Tibetans now. We are only about 130,000 Tibetans in exile, with about 7.5 million Tibetans in Tibet. If you can trust the Chinese numbers, that's based on 2020 census. So only we are very few in number, but still we are very united by the fact that we have to continue. We have to keep continuing to struggle for our country. So His Holiness worked for many years. First 30 years of democracy was very difficult. We had to adjust a lot. People had no idea what democracy meant, what democratic institutions and organizations you need to make it function. But today, after 65 years, we have become the only or the exemplary governance in exile with a fully functional democratic polity. We have our Supreme Justice Commission, we have our Parliament with 45 members, we have our cabinet with 7 departments: home, religion and culture, education, health, finance, security, and information and international relations. And then we have our election commission. We have also our election coming up every 5 years, and we have to conduct election in 26 different countries, and we do that in one day. We are the only one to have this experience. So it's a very unique, some call it project, it's a very unique experience of the Tibetans in exile, and we don't exist if it is not for the government of India. So everywhere I go, people ask us, how is your relation with the government of India? How is government of India supporting you? I keep saying, if it is not for the government of India, we don't exist. That's it. So our biggest benefactor is government of India, and the next is United States. You heard the United States cut off all the foreign assistance after Trump 2. We have been working overtime with the State Department and Congress and our friends on the Hill in Washington, D.C. to get back some of it, and we got half of it back. As of today, we are still working to get the rest of the funding back. So this is where we stand. So, of course, with the Tibetan issue, the Sino-Tibet conflict, uh, His Holiness has proposed this pragmatic approach called the middle way policy that is based on the Buddhist philosophy of Madhyamika. Right? So when His Holiness says middle, asking for genuine autonomy, because Tibet already is called as Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Prefecture, Tibet Autonomous County, and you have these very nice words in the 1984 law on national regional autonomy based on the 1982 Constitution of China. But what is being implemented on the ground and what is the reality on the ground are two different things. What the law says and what is being implemented on the ground are two different things. With China, you always have this two phases. Whether it's the system of governance where you have the Communist Party and the People's Congresses, when it comes to decision making, it's always the Communist Party parallel organization that takes the decisions. If you think you are meeting with a Chinese minister today, you are wrong. Because every governmental body has a commission behind that who takes all the decisions. And that has strengthened over the years since Xi Jinping took over. The commissions are more powerful than government agencies. So when His Holiness talks about the middle, then there are ends to it. Right? Middle is asking for genuine autonomy, not only in name but also in practice. And the two ends, of course, it could be multiple dimensional ends. But if you talk politically, one end is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, and the other end is the current situation in occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. So the middle way is seeking for genuine autonomy. And so we are still very committed to find a middle way solution because His Holiness always appreciates the larger interests of humanity. He appreciates the concept of European Union. Even now His Holiness says that if it had not been for the concept of European Union, Europeans would still be fighting and killing each other. So if that can be applied to Europe, then why not with Tibet? Because we don't have a Hanumanji to lift Tibet out of that place and take it somewhere else. So whenever we get to go back, we have to live with the Chinese. We have to live with the Nepalese, Indians as our neighbors. And if we have to live as neighbors, then why don't we live in peace with each other? It doesn't make sense to fight with neighbors all the time. Whether it's in your immediate vicinity or as nations, we have to learn to live at peace. So on that basis, we are still very committed to finding a non-violent, negotiated, mutually beneficial solution that could be lasting. If you look at the one conflicts that are going around in the world today, you don't know whether you're resolving one problem or you're creating more problems for the future. So after I came into this office, we decided to change the strategy a little bit by focusing on the ends rather than the middle to gain value for middle way, to gain leverage for middle way. If there is no acceptance of the ends, then middle way doesn't make any sense. Right? So we have been working for 2 years with the US Congress between 2022 and 2024 on a law called the Resolve Tibet Act, which got passed through the Congress and then signed into law by President Biden last July. So it's called the Resolve Tibet Act. The United States is the only government that has a law on Tibet called the 2002 Tibet Policy Act. And that came about after China became a part of the World Trade Organization and after China got the opportunity to host their coming out party, the Olympics, in 2010, which was granted to them way back in 2001. So all these developments started from there, and it was amended to Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020, which also states that Chinese authorities who would be responsible for choosing the next Dalai Lama would be sanctioned by the US government. These are quite strong words in a law that has some teeth. And this law, the Resolve Tibet Act, talks about four major issues. One, China says there is no Tibet problem. Tibet is a socialist paradise. This law says that Sino-Tibet conflict or dispute is yet to be resolved conflict, and it needs to be resolved under international law. The second part of that law speaks about the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. And this is very much in line with the 1961 UN General Assembly resolution on Tibet, that the Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. And some of the other countries also adopt similar position on Tibet. Third part of, which is the most important part, which we have been focusing on, is China's distortion or China's misinformation on Tibetan history. The law says that China's narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times is not accepted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the United States government also does not accept this. So this is a first of this kind of repudiation of China's false narrative on Tibetan history. And the fourth part of the law talks about the territory of Tibet. Even in India, many journalists, many newspapers, many maybe even official and non-governmental organizations, when they come out with a map of Tibet, they come out with only Tibet Autonomous Region, how China defines it. Now China has even renamed just like they are renaming parts of Arunachal Pradesh, they have renamed Tibet as Xizang. Of course, Tibet used to be called Xizang during the Qing dynasty, but when the Communist Party says Xizang, it has a different connotation. It refers only to Tibet Autonomous Region. That is why we request governments and newspapers to refrain from using this term Xizang that China uses for Tibet, because it means only Tibet Autonomous Region from their perspective. It does not include the other two provinces of Tibet. So we have been quite successful in the United States to move this one step forward. Now we have to work with other like-minded countries around the world to get similar resolutions. But for this year, we celebrated His Holiness' 90th birthday. We are celebrating the whole year as Year of Compassion, because the message of ahimsa and karuna that's rooted in ancient Indian wisdom is very much relevant today and very much needed today. As we speak, we are talking about more than 55 violent conflicts. We are talking about, some are saying, more than 100 violent conflicts that are happening around the world. So we need non-violence as a means to resolve problems. So that is where we stand. When we reach out to governments, we tell them, if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, People's Republic of China, you are going against international law. Because what happened to Tibet 75 years ago, and what is happening to Ukraine today with Russian invasion are the same. There is only one international law after Second World War. There are no two international laws that can be applied to different situations. And then we also tell the international community that on the one hand, they keep saying Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, and then on the other hand, they keep saying, oh, we support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. I tell them, you are contradicting yourself, these two positions. When you keep saying Tibet is a part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? And the third thing we tell them is, why do you think Chinese government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China? No, I have not seen any other country asking any other country to say this is part of us, you have to support that. That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule over Tibet. And they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community. And when the international community keeps repeating these statements, you are siding with the Chinese government already. You're not being unbiased. You're already biased. So these are some of the things we tell the international community and request them to recognize the historical status. We are not asking governments to lie about Tibetan history. Whatever was a fact needs to be recognized. If you are not able to recognize fact, then you capitulate to political needs of that time. So this is how we try to approach. This is what we are trying to explain to different communities, to different governments, and we are taking one step at a time because it's not an easy task. There are a lot of issues in this world. Tibet is one, but it's considered small by many, and it's non-violent in nature. So I keep telling the Americans, if you support non-violent activities, it will come in few millions. But if it becomes violent, then it goes into billions. This non-violence is much cheaper. Then we also need to understand what China is doing. I keep traveling to even some Latin American countries, and some of my friends tell me, "Why you are going to Latin America? You don't have governmental support there." But I say to our Indian friends also, there are some things that we can speak that you cannot speak. Indian diplomats cannot speak about all these things which we can speak. And so I go around this country, and of course we go there, we realize two things. One, if there has to be a resolution, a peaceful resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, it can come only